That morning, the message appeared on my phone like a quiet bullet. "Morning, Mom. I borrowed your old ring for the party last night. Hope you don't mind. Vanessa." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue bubble glowing against the pale light of dawn. Then slowly I smiled. Because the old ring Vanessa was talking about wasn't just another piece of jewelry tossed in a drawer. It was the Carter pink diamond, a 5-carat pink gem worth $2.5 million, the most precious heirloom my late husband Henry ever left me. He once told me, "If anyone touches that ring without your consent, they've declared war on this family." I typed back, "Have fun, dear," pressed send, and then reached for my landline. When Richard Hale answered, his voice was still gravelly from sleep. "Richard," I said, steady as a blade, "register the theft. Inventory item 214, the pink diamond." An hour later, police cars were already headed toward Vanessa's elegant mansion on River's Edge Drive. But when they opened her safe, they didn't just find the ring. They found something that would shake all of Charleston to its core. The sun crept through the lace curtains of my kitchen window as I sat with my tea, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the magnolia trees. My hands didn't shake. They hadn't shaken in a long time. You don't live almost 70 years, lose a husband, raise a son, and survive a decade under the same roof with a woman like Vanessa without learning the art of stillness. To outsiders, she was dazzling, a 3-5-year-old influencer who spoke in honeyed tones and smiled through teeth whiter than pearls. To me, she was entitlement in heels. She'd married my son Jason 10 years ago, the same year Henry died. And from the moment she moved into Carter House, she treated me as though I were part of the antique furniture, valuable but inconvenient. I used to hear her voice echo through the marble hallway. "Evelyn, could you make me a coffee before my meeting?" Or, "Evelyn, the floors creak when you walk. Can you move quieter?" "No, please. No, thank you. Never, Mom." Just orders wrapped in fake politeness. Jason would glance at me with that helpless half-smile, whispering, "She doesn't mean it that way, Mom." But silence became his specialty. Charleston society adored her. She'd host charity luncheons in my dining room, serving champagne under chandeliers Henry had imported from Venice, pretending she was the lady of the estate. The guests, social wives in pastel dresses, would clap their manicured hands and say, "Vanessa, your home is exquisite." Not one of them realized the home was mine. When Henry passed, he left behind more than the Carter house. He left behind a hidden world, a collection of jewelry, art, and antiques worth over $12 million, all cataloged and insured under the Carter estate inventory. Henry had been a museum curator before we retired here. His greatest treasure was that pink diamond ring designed in 1919 by a French jeweler named Émile Rochefort, known as the Pink Heart. To the untrained eye, it looked vintage but ordinary. To an expert, it was priceless. And to me, it was sacred. That morning, as the wind brushed the jasmine vines outside, I unlocked the portrait room, the one place in the house Vanessa never dared enter. Behind Henry's favorite painting, an old oil of the Charleston harbor, lay a small steel safe. When I spun the dial, the door opened with a sigh, like the house itself exhaling secrets. Inside, rows of velvet boxes gleamed faintly in the dim light. Each had a handwritten tag in Henry's careful penmanship: item 102 emerald brooch, 1,885. Item 214 pink diamond ring, 1,919. I ran my fingers over the leather-bound ledger beside them, Carter inventory log, and whispered, "You always knew, didn't you, Henry? You knew this day would come." I remembered his words the night before he died. "Evelyn, I'm leaving you more than wealth. I'm leaving you proof. If anyone ever questions your worth, show them this ledger." I never thought I'd need to use it against my own family. Downstairs, the faint click of Vanessa's heels broke my reverie. I heard her voice drifting from the hallway. "Jason, don't forget the gala starts at 7. I still can't find the right accessory for my gold gown." Her tone was sweet, but I could picture her face, frustrated, pouty, desperate for attention. That gala at the Riverfront Hotel was her yearly stage where Charleston's wives competed in silent warfare of diamonds and designer gowns. When she said she'd borrowed my old ring, I knew exactly why. She wanted the perfect sparkle for the cameras, something rare enough to make her feel untouchable. What she didn't realize was that she'd just put her manicured hand on a time bomb. I poured myself another cup of tea, flipped the ledger to the right page, and wrote with a steady hand, April 14th, 7:42 a.m. Item 214 removed by Vanessa Carter without permission. Then I called Richard Hale, Henry's best friend, and our family lawyer. He'd been waiting years for this phone call. "Evelyn," he said, his voice sharpening, "you're sure you want to do this? Once we file, there's no turning back." "I've been sure for 10 years, I replied. "I'm tired of watching her steal the air in my own house." "All right, I'll contact the insurer. When the report hits the system, the police will treat it as theft of a registered asset. Estimated value $2.5 million. That qualifies as grand larceny." "Good," I said. "It's about time someone called it what it is." The clock ticked toward 8. Outside, the sun burned through the morning fog, painting the rose bushes gold. I could already imagine Vanessa posing at the gala tonight, that pink diamond flashing on her finger, telling her followers it was just an heirloom. She'd smile, clink her glass, and think the world was hers. But by the time she returned home, the world would have changed. When I ended the call, I sat in Henry's old armchair and closed my eyes. 10 years of humiliation replayed in silence. The dinners where Vanessa introduced me as Jason's mom instead of Mrs. Carter, the Christmas when she gave me a cheap scarf and said simple things suit your age. The night she laughed to her friends, I swear this old lady treats her antiques better than herself. They all blurred together until they became one feeling, an ache that settled behind my ribs. But this time there was something else woven into it. Resolve. I rose, straightened my back, and walked to the window. Across the street, the magnolia trees swayed in the breeze, heavy with blossoms. For the first time in a decade, I felt like I could breathe. The invisible woman was gone. In her place stood someone Henry would have recognized, the curator of her own destiny. At exactly 9:13 a.m., my phone buzzed again. A text from Richard filed, case number 48321B, police en route. I watched the notification fade from the screen. In another part of town, Vanessa was probably sipping mimosas at her vanity, rehearsing poses, never realizing that each flash of that diamond would be one step closer to her undoing. As I placed the phone on the table, I whispered to Henry's photograph, "It's starting, love. The reckoning you warned me about." Outside, the Charleston morning shimmered deceptively peaceful as blue lights began to flicker in the distance. And that was the moment I knew the story of the stolen pink diamond had only just begun. People think betrayal always arrives with shouting. In my case, it came dressed in silk and lipstick, smiling as she poured wine at my husband's funeral dinner. 10 years ago, when Jason first brought Vanessa home, she looked like everything a Southern mother might wish for in a daughter-in-law: graceful, educated, ambitious. She hugged me too tightly and called me Mom with a syrupy voice that somehow felt rehearsed. Henry had leaned over that night and whispered, "That girl knows exactly what she's after." I brushed it off. I wanted to believe Jason had found happiness. But a year later, Henry was gone, and Vanessa began rearranging the world he left behind. The first dinner after his burial, Vanessa invited her friends over to lift the mood. I prepared a roast, Henry's favorite, but when the guests arrived, she smiled sweetly and said, "Evelyn, why don't you eat in the sunroom? It's quieter there." The laughter from the dining room echoed through the hallway while I sat alone among the ferns, my plate cold. Jason peeked in once, uneasy. "Mom, she's just stressed," he murmured. I nodded, because what else was there to do? By the next Thanksgiving, she had fully taken command. The dining table, once adorned with Henry's silver candlesticks, now shimmered with gold-trimmed plates she'd ordered from Paris. When I suggested we make Henry's famous rosemary turkey, she wrinkled her nose. "That recipe is a bit old-fashioned. Don't you think I'm doing a citrus glaze? It photographs better." I watched her sprinkle herbs like a performer chasing perfection for a camera lens instead of a family memory. That night, after her guests left, I stayed behind to clean. The only person who complimented my homemade apple pie was the housekeeper. "Best I've ever had, Mrs. Carter," she said softly. I smiled, but the sweetness of that moment vanished the next morning when Vanessa replaced my pie tins with designer ceramic molds. She was good at erasing things. The first year, she started with the kitchen curtains too floral, she said. Then came Henry's study, stripped of the scent of pipe tobacco and leather, repainted a sterile white. She replaced our wedding portraits with framed shots of herself at charity galas. One afternoon I came downstairs and saw my husband's photographs stacked on a pile of donation items. When I asked where she planned to send them, she replied, "Don't be sentimental, Evelyn. These old photos make the place feel heavy." Jason never stopped her. He just lowered his head, choosing peace over confrontation. Each silence carved another piece out of me. By my 65th birthday, Vanessa had turned pretending into art. She threw a party for me, streamers, champagne, and a 3-layer cake shaped like a pearl necklace. Cameras clicked as she announced everyone a toast to our beloved Evelyn, the woman who taught me everything about class. Then she handed me a small box wrapped in gold ribbon. Inside was a cheap polyester scarf. "Something simple," she said, "since you don't go out much anymore." The guests laughed politely. The photographers captured her perfect smile. Jason kissed my cheek, whispering, "Smile for the pictures, Mom." I did. Later, alone in my room, I folded the scarf neatly into the bottom drawer. I've never worn it. There was something chilling about how easily she could play the perfect wife in public while treating me like a ghost at home. Every social event turned into a performance. At a country club luncheon, she raised her glass and said, "Jason's mom still lives with us. Bless her heart. We can't convince her to move to a retirement community." The other women chuckled. "You know how old folks get attached to their stuff?" I excused myself and went to the restroom, stared at my reflection in the mirror, and whispered, "You are not invisible." But my voice sounded too soft to believe. Charleston high society adored Vanessa. They called her the modern Southern belle. She had thousands of followers who admired her posts about family elegance. What they didn't see was that I spent most evenings eating dinner alone in the back garden because she said my presence made guests uncomfortable. I learned to listen instead of speak. From the kitchen doorway, I overheard the cracks in her mask. One night she was on the phone with her sister Gretchen, her laughter slicing through the dark hallway. "This old woman is driving me insane," she said. "She lives in that giant house like some forgotten duchess surrounded by junk. Jason's too soft to tell her it's time to move. When she finally leaves, I'm turning this place into my studio, bright, modern, alive." I stood frozen, my hand gripping the doorframe. For the first time, I didn't cry. I simply felt something close to clarity. That night, I walked into Henry's study. The smell of cedar still lingered faintly in the walls. I opened the old drawer of his desk and took out the small brass key he had once handed me. "This key," he'd said, "is to the only room in the house that truly belongs to you." I hadn't touched it since his death. My fingers trembled as I held it, the metal cool against my skin. The next morning, Vanessa was filming another home tour for her followers. "Welcome to our historic Carter house," she said cheerfully into the camera. "We're renovating to give it a modern touch." I stood at the end of the hallway watching her gesture toward Henry's paintings and family heirlooms. "These old pieces will soon be replaced," she chirped. "My husband's mother has such traditional taste." I walked past the camera, quietly invisible even on film. Later, when the video went viral, one viewer commented, "Who's the old woman in the background?" Vanessa deleted the comment within an hour. By then, the house no longer felt like home. She had painted over the past with bright, empty colors. Jason was too lost in his work to notice. And I had become the ghost she wanted me to be. But ghosts, I've learned, can see everything. One Sunday morning, while polishing the silver Henry left behind, I noticed something missing: the antique jade bracelet I kept in a velvet pouch. I searched every drawer, every box, but it was gone. The housekeeper, Clara, looked uneasy when I asked her. "Mrs. Carter, I think Mrs. Vanessa borrowed it last month for a photo shoot." I nodded slowly, thanked her, and went upstairs. In my ledger, I wrote item 102 missing after Vanessa's event. That small act of record-keeping gave me an odd sense of power. For years, she'd convinced Jason I was forgetful, clumsy, aging into confusion. But now I had proof: dates, numbers, details. My memory wasn't fading, it was being stolen. That evening, Clara stayed late to help me close the shutters. Before leaving, she whispered, "Mrs. Evelyn, I saw her taking pictures of your jewelry again yesterday. Maybe you should lock things up." I looked at her and said quietly, "Don't worry, Clara. I'm locking more than jewelry." At dinner, Vanessa announced plans for an upcoming charity gala at the Riverfront Hotel. "Everyone important will be there," she said, eyes gleaming. "But I still can't find the perfect ring for my gold gown." Jason smiled distracted. "You'll find something." She sighed dramatically. "If only I had something truly unique." That sentence hung in the air like a storm warning. I set down my fork, heart steady, because in that moment I knew which something unique she had in mind. That night, while she rehearsed her speech in front of a mirror, I sat in Henry's old study, the brass key warm in my hand, and whispered to myself, "You wanted me gone, Vanessa, but I'm still here, and I see you." Outside, the magnolia trees rustled under the evening wind, scattering white petals like quiet witnesses. In the silence of Carter House, I realized what Henry meant all those years ago when he said, "One day this key will open more than a door." Vanessa thought she was erasing an old woman's past. What she didn't know was that my past was worth millions, and it was perfectly documented. The morning of the gala began like any other, too quiet, too bright, and filled with that strange stillness that only comes before a storm. I was in the garden trimming the lavender when I heard the faint creak of my bedroom door upstairs. That sound soft, as it was traveled through me like a pulse. From where I stood, I could see her reflection in the glass window, Vanessa gliding into my room as if it already belonged to her. She didn't knock, didn't pause. Her silk robe shimmered gold in the sunlight as she moved straight toward the dresser where I kept my jewelry box. I stayed still, pruning the flowers, my hands careful and slow though my chest burned. Inside, she opened the wooden chest, the one that held my less valuable pieces. Pearls, brooches, old rings from Henry's collection. I saw her fingers stop on one particular box. She lifted the lid, and the pink diamond caught the light like a living flame. She held it up, smiling to herself in the mirror, admiring her reflection. I could almost hear her thoughts, "Perfect." When she turned slightly, the diamond flashed again, rose gold, pale fire, pride, and greed all in one glint. She slipped it onto her finger, tilting her hand to see how it looked against her manicure. Then, as if rehearsing a lie, she practiced a half smile and said under her breath, "Oh, it's just an old ring from my mother-in-law." That was when I knew. It wasn't curiosity or impulse, it was calculation. She had planned it. By the time she left my room, I was calm. I finished watering the roses, wiped my hands on my apron, and went inside to pour tea. At 9:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. "I borrowed your old ring for the party, Grandma. Hope you don't mind." The message felt almost smug, like she was testing how far she could go. I looked at it, smiled, and replied, "Have fun, dear." Then I dialed Richard Hale. He answered after 2 rings, voice brisk as always. "Evelyn, is something wrong?" "Yes," I said softly. "And it's finally the right kind of wrong. File a report for the theft of inventory item 214, value 2.5 million. There was a silence, the kind that carries both shock and respect. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely." She took it, Richard. "And I want every word on record." While he began the process, I sat at my desk in Henry's study and wrote in my ledger, April 21st. Vanessa Carter took the pink heart without permission. The ink bled slightly on the old paper. My hand didn't tremble. It took less than an hour for Richard to call back. The report's filed. The insurer and police are already notified. Because it's a registered asset, the case moves fast. How fast, I asked? "They'll have a recovery warrant within the hour." I thanked him, then went upstairs and changed into a simple navy dress. Something told me I'd want to look composed when the news broke. At 10:30, the first patrol car passed by Carter House. I watched it from the window as it turned toward the main road leading to the Riverfront Hotel. The siren wasn't on, but the blue lights pulsed faintly through the daylight like a heartbeat. For 10 years I dreamed of a moment when the truth would reveal itself. I just never expected it to arrive this quietly. By early afternoon, the city was buzzing about the charity gala. Vanessa had spent weeks boasting about it online. A celebration of Southern grace she'd written under a photo of her golden gown. Jason had left that morning to join her there. When he kissed my cheek goodbye, he said, "Mom, try to stay off social media tonight. Okay, Vanessa wants to keep the focus positive." I smiled and told him not to worry. At 6:15 p.m., I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the living room window. The sunset brushed Charleston in orange and rose the exact shades of the pink heart. I pictured her at the ballroom laughing under crystal chandeliers, showing off her old ring proud and oblivious. At 6:47, my phone rang. Richard's number. "It's happening," he said. "They've served the warrant. We're at the Riverfront Hotel. Security's cooperating. Police are going in discreetly." My heart didn't race, it simply steadied. "Thank you, Richard." "Evelyn," he added, his voice softer. "Are you sure you don't want to call Jason first? Once this goes public, there's no undoing it." "No," I said. "He made his choices. Now I'll make mine." Outside, a breeze stirred the garden. I set down my glass and went to stand among the lavender. The air smelled sharp and clean. Somewhere in the distance, faint sirens began to wail. When the call came again 15 minutes later, I already knew what it would be. Evelyn Richard said the police have the ring. It was on her finger when they arrived. I exhaled slowly. "And Jason, he's confused, angry. He keeps saying it's a misunderstanding. The press is already there." "Good," I murmured. "Let them film everything." She always loved the cameras. The sound of cicadas filled the evening air. I sat on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky and thought about Henry. He would have smiled at this moment, not out of cruelty, but out of justice. He'd always believed in letting people expose themselves. At 8:20, Jason called. His voice was trembling. "Mom, what did you do?" "The police just raided the gala. They say Vanessa stole a $2.5 million ring." "That's insane." "It's not insane," I said evenly. "It's documented. That ring was never hers to take." He sounded breathless. "But you never told me it was worth that much." She thought it was costume jewelry. "You have to tell them this is a misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding, Jason. It's theft." She walked into my room, opened my box, and took what didn't belong to her. "And she's done it before." "What do you mean before?" "I mean she's been stealing from me for years." Silence. Then the sound of him exhaling a long, broken sigh. "Mom," he said finally, "please don't do this. The reporters are everywhere. This will destroy her reputation." "Her reputation," I repeated quietly. "That's what you're worried about. She's my wife," he said weakly. "And I'm your mother. For 10 years she's humiliated me in this house, made me invisible. And you let her." "That's not true." "Yes, it is," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "You just never wanted to see it." He didn't answer. I heard distant voices in the background, officers' flashes from cameras, the hum of chaos that follows the guilty. "I have to go," he said finally. "I'll call you later." "You won't need to," I said and hung up. The night grew still. I could almost feel Henry's presence beside me on the porch, that steady warmth he carried even in silence. For the first time in years, I felt safe inside my own walls. Around 9:30, Clara arrived, her apron still dusted with flour from her evening shift at the bakery. "Mrs. Carter," she whispered, "I saw it on the news. They arrested her. The police took the ring." I nodded. "They found more than that." "What do you mean?" I looked toward the darkened street where the blue light still flickered faintly in the distance. "You'll see, this isn't just about a ring. It's about everything she's ever taken and everything I'm finally taking back." Clara set a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing." I gave her a tired smile. "The right thing," I said softly, "just took me 10 years. That night I slept in peace for the first time in a decade. The house no longer felt haunted. The air was lighter, the silence no longer cruel but sacred. And though I didn't yet know what the police had found in Vanessa's safe, I had the strangest feeling that the story of that pink diamond had only revealed its first chapter. The call came just after dawn. Richard's voice was clipped, urgent. "Evelyn, you need to come down to the precinct. They've found more than the ring." I sat on the edge of my bed, the morning light slanting across the carpet like long, pale blades. For a moment I thought he meant another heirloom, maybe one of Henry's watches or the pearl brooch I'd lost years ago. But then he said the words that made my chest tighten. "There were other items in Vanessa's safe, pieces that don't belong to you. The FBI is taking over. At 71 you'd think nothing could shock me anymore, but that did." By the time I reached the station, Charleston was already awake to the scandal. Reporters stood outside their microphones angled toward every car that pulled up. The sign on the precinct door read Federal Task Force. Inside, I saw the officers moving briskly, phones ringing the low hum of something much bigger than a family dispute. Richard met me at the entrance. His tie was crooked, his eyes shadowed. "They've been cataloging evidence all night," he said. "You need to see this yourself." In a side room, a long table was covered with velvet trays. Jewelry glittered under the fluorescent lights, rings, brooches, pearls, and silver coins. I recognized some of them instantly. "That's my mother's sapphire pin," I whispered. "And that's Henry's gold cufflink." Richard nodded grimly. "Those are yours, yes. But the rest?" He handed me a sheet. "Belonged to at least 4 other families in Charleston." I stared at him. 4, he lowered his voice. "Vanessa wasn't just stealing from you. She was running something much larger. Selling antiques, art, jewelry, anything she could get her hands on." My stomach twisted. Out of my house, mostly from social events. She'd photograph expensive items at fundraisers, then send them to a dealer in Atlanta. He'd appraise them and she'd arrange quiet sales. It's been going on for at least 2 years. The air in the room felt heavy, almost oily. I looked at the rows of glittering evidence, traces of lives she'd violated, families she'd betrayed. My mind reeled back through all those charity luncheons, the house tours, the endless compliments from her friends. "She used my house to build her reputation," I murmured. "And behind it, she built a crime." Richard hesitated. "There's something else." He opened a folder. "Agent Karen Brooks from the FBI will brief us. They think Vanessa was part of a regional theft network. She wasn't working alone." Before I could reply, the door opened, and a woman in her 40s stepped in wearing a navy suit and the kind of expression that said she'd seen everything twice. "Mrs. Carter, I'm Agent Brooks." "Thank you for coming." I shook her hand. I didn't have a choice. She motioned toward a laptop. "We've been analyzing your daughter-in-law's phone. She's been in communication with several known art brokers. In one email, she sent photos of multiple jewelry pieces, including your ring, under the subject line, Available Assets. I swallowed. Assets. She was inventorying your belongings as if they were her own. We also found floor plans of your home, labeled. Richard's head snapped up. Floor plans. Agent Brooks turned the screen toward us. There it was, an image of Carter House drawn digitally. Every room labeled, including the safe hidden behind Henry's portrait. She knew exactly where everything was, the agent said. I felt cold all over. She mapped the house. My bedroom, my study, everything. "Yes, ma'am," Agent Brooks said softly. "She was planning a much bigger theft. We believe your pink diamond was supposed to be her last trophy before she moved on to larger targets." For a long moment I couldn't speak. The truth was both devastating and liberating. All those years of humiliation had hidden something far darker than I imagined. "What happens to her now?" I asked finally. "She's in custody," Brooks said. "But she's not cooperating. She insists you gave her permission to wear the ring. She's demanding your presence to confirm ownership before we proceed with federal charges." Richard looked at me carefully. "It's your choice, Evelyn. You don't have to face her today, but I did. I needed to." When we entered the holding area, Vanessa was seated behind the glass wall, her golden hair disheveled, mascara smudged around her eyes. She still managed a half smile when she saw me, the same one she used to charm everyone at her parties. "Evelyn," she said through the intercom, "thank God you're here. This is all a misunderstanding. I borrowed your ring, that's all. Tell them." I met her gaze. "A misunderstanding, yes. I was going to return it. I just wanted to look my best for the gala." Richard pressed the button beside me. "Mrs. Carter, we have video evidence, text messages, and inventory records that say otherwise." She shot him a glare, then turned back to me. "Evelyn, you know, I've always respected you." The laugh escaped me before I could stop it, sharp, humorless. "Respected me. You erased me. You humiliated me. You turned my home into a showroom for your lies." Her eyes darted nervously. "You're overreacting. You're old. You misremember things." I leaned closer to the glass. "That excuse won't work anymore. The FBI has your emails, your plans, your buyers. They even have your maps. The only thing you've miscalculated is me. For the first time, her face lost its practiced poise. Vanessa Carter, an officer, said behind her, "You're under federal investigation for grand larceny, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Her voice cracked. "This is insane. Jason will fix this." I stood straighter. "Jason can't fix what you broke." "And neither can I." They led her away, her protests echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Outside, the air was heavy with humidity, the sky bruised with storm clouds. Richard walked beside me, his voice low. "You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen. I just told the truth," I said, "something she never could." We stopped at the steps of the courthouse. I looked out at the city where church bells chimed distantly. "Do you know what she told her friends once?" I said quietly. "That I was too old to know what I had. That I wouldn't even notice if half my things disappeared." Richard's expression softened. "Well, she was wrong. I murmured. "And she's about to learn what it means to underestimate someone who's kept records." That night I sat at my desk, the ledger open before me. The pages smelled faintly of ink and cedar. I turned to the newest entry, the one dated that morning, federal seizure confirmed, ring recovered, suspect in custody. But even as I wrote it, I sensed this wasn't over. People like Vanessa didn't crumble quietly. They schemed even in chains. When the phone rang again at midnight, it was Agent Brooks. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I wanted to inform you we found more in her files. A document drafted with a law firm in Atlanta. It's a petition to declare you mentally incompetent." For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. "She wanted to become your legal guardian," Brooks continued. "It would have given her control of the entire Carter estate." My voice came out barely above a whisper. "She planned to have me declared unfit." "Yes, ma'am. I'm afraid she was close to filing." I closed my eyes, my hand gripping the phone. "Thank you, Agent Brooks." After I hung up, I sat there in the quiet, listening to the ticking of the clock. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain drumming against the windows. Vanessa hadn't just stolen my jewelry, she'd tried to steal my life. And now, for the first time in 10 years, I was ready to take it back, all of it. The morning after the storm, Charleston smelled of wet magnolia and rain-soaked asphalt. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, the same table where Vanessa once told me, "You should really downsize, Evelyn. This house is far too big for someone your age." Now her words echoed through empty rooms like a curse that had turned on its speaker. Jason's car pulled up at the front gate just after 9. I heard the tires crunch against the gravel, and my heart tightened, not with anger this time, but with something closer to weariness. When he walked in, his shirt was wrinkled, his eyes swollen from lack of sleep. "Mom," he began, his voice raw, "we need to talk." I set my cup down and waited. "They're saying terrible things about Vanessa on the news," he said. "Fraud, theft, conspiracy." "It's not true, Mom. It can't be. She's not capable of that." I looked at him, my only child, 40 years old and still blind when it came to the woman he loved. "Sit down, Jason," I said quietly. "You need to hear the truth before you start defending her." He hesitated, then sat across from me. I opened the folder Richard had left the night before. Inside were printed photographs, email screenshots, and inventory lists with Vanessa's name in the corner. "These came from her computer," I said. "She was selling my jewelry, small pieces at first, the ones I didn't wear often. Then she planned something bigger. The petition to declare me incompetent. It would have given her control over everything Henry and I built." Jason's face drained of color. "That's impossible." "Is it?" I slid one photograph across the table. It showed Vanessa at a pawn shop counter, smiling faintly while holding my emerald brooch under the light. "That's from security footage in Savannah. She told them it was an heirloom from her grandmother." He leaned forward, eyes wide. "Where did you get these?" "From the detective Richard hired. He started investigating months ago when I told him small items were going missing." Jason rubbed his temples. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me," I said simply. "You never did." He looked up sharply, guilt flickering in his eyes. "That's not fair. It's the truth. Every time I mentioned something missing, you said I probably misplaced it. Every time she humiliated me in public, you told me not to make a scene. You wanted peace, Jason. But peace bought with silence is just surrender." He sank back in his chair. "I thought you were exaggerating," he whispered. "She told me you were forgetful, that you were slipping." I smiled sadly. Of course she did. It was part of her plan. Convince you I was losing my mind so no one would believe me when the thefts began. For a long time neither of us spoke. The ticking clock filled the space between us, each sound a reminder of how much time we'd both wasted. Then Jason said quietly, "I loved her, Mom. I still do. I don't know how to stop." "You don't have to stop loving her," I said. "But you do have to stop letting that love make you blind." He looked at me helplessly. "What do I do now?" "You face what she's done, and you stop protecting her from the consequences she created." Before he could respond, there was a knock on the door. Clara stepped in holding a small USB drive in her hand. "Mrs. Carter," she said softly, "I thought you should have this. It's from the camera in the kitchen. You told me to keep it running after those earrings went missing. I took it from her, my pulse quickening." "Thank you, Clara. You've done more for this family than most of its members." Jason frowned. "What's that proof?" I said. We plugged the drive into the laptop. The footage appeared grainy but clear. The timestamp read 3 weeks earlier. The camera showed Vanessa walking into the kitchen alone. She looked around, then opened the small cabinet where I kept a jewelry tray for cleaning. She picked up a pair of pearl earrings, studied them, and slipped them into her pocket. Then she turned toward the window and spoke into her phone. "She'll never notice. She's too senile to remember what she owns," she said, laughing softly before leaving the room. Jason covered his mouth, eyes filling with tears. Oh my God. I watched his face crumble, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. Just an overwhelming sadness for the son who had spent 10 years defending a woman who saw him as nothing more than a means to an inheritance. When the video ended, Jason closed the laptop slowly. "I need to see her," he said. "I need to hear it from her." "Then you'll hear more lies," I replied gently. "People like Vanessa don't confess, they perform." He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "I have to try." As he walked out, I called after him. "Jason," he turned at the door. "Whatever happens, remember, this truth doesn't destroy families, lies do." The door closed behind him and I was alone again. Hours later, Richard arrived with an update. "The FBI has expanded the case," he said. "They've linked Vanessa to a network of antique brokers in 3 states. She's been selling more than jewelry, paintings, silver, even rare books." I sat back stunned. "So she used my connections, my home, to scout her victims?" "Yes. And the Bureau believes your house was her base of operations." I laughed softly, a sound without joy. How poetic. "The woman who wanted to erase me built her empire under my roof." Richard hesitated. "Evelyn, there's something else. They found drafts of emails between her and a lawyer in Atlanta discussing how to obtain guardianship over you. It wasn't just an idea she was preparing to file. I looked out the window. The sky had turned the color of pewter, heavy with rain. "She almost succeeded," I said quietly. "She made everyone think I was losing my mind. Even my son." "She won't succeed now," Richard said. "The evidence is solid. The Bureau is preparing formal charges for fraud, theft, and elder abuse." "Elder abuse," I repeated. The words felt both foreign and strangely comforting. Someone had finally named what I'd endured. When Richard left, I stayed at the window long after the rain began. I watched the water slide down the glass in thin, trembling lines. I thought of Henry, of the years we'd spent building this home, and of how easily silence had almost destroyed it. Around dusk, Jason returned. His clothes were soaked from the rain, his eyes hollow. He stood in the doorway like a boy who'd lost his way home. "She admitted it," he said, his voice breaking. "Not all of it, but enough. She said she needed the money, that she deserved a better life. She said you wouldn't miss what you never used." I folded my arms. "And what did you say?" He looked down. "I told her she was wrong. About everything." I wanted to feel relief, but what I felt was exhaustion. The kind that settles deep past anger and grief into something quieter. Jason stepped closer. "Mom, I'm sorry. For every time I made you doubt yourself. For believing her over you." I placed a hand on his cheek the same way I used to when he was a boy. "I forgive you," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just lets us live with it." Outside, the rain eased into a mist. The magnolia leaves gleamed under the porch light. Jason turned toward the door. What happens now? Now, I said, we let justice finish what I started. When he left, I closed the door, leaned against it, and whispered to the empty house, "You can rest now, Henry." The truth is finally louder than her lies. In the distance, a thunderclap rolled across the bay, and for the first time in a decade, the air inside Carter House felt clean. By sunrise, Carter House was surrounded by news vans. The headlines had already hit every Charleston paper: socialite Vanessa Carter under federal investigation for art and jewelry theft. I watched from behind the lace curtains, the same window where I'd once stood waiting for Jason to come home from school. Now strangers were parked outside my gate, whispering my name as if I were part of a crime show. Clara peeked out from the parlor and said softly, "Mrs. Carter, they're not here for you. They're here because of you." I smiled faintly. After all these years, that's a nice change. The phone rang around 8. It was Richard. "Evelyn, the FBI wants to meet at your house this morning. Agent Brooks is bringing new information." She said it's significant. I sighed. "Tell her to bring coffee. I have a feeling I'll need it." Half an hour later, 3 government cars rolled into the driveway. The agents stepped out in dark suits, their shoes crunching on the gravel. Agent Brooks led them, composed as always, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She shook my hand firmly. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for cooperating. We've uncovered evidence that broadens this case far beyond what we initially thought." "Broader than a stolen ring?" I asked. "Much broader," she said, opening her file. "Your daughter-in-law wasn't just selling your jewelry. She's part of a coordinated ring trafficking stolen antiques across state lines. We've confirmed at least 8 wealthy families in South Carolina and Georgia were targeted. She used your social circles as her access point." I sank into my chair, my heart tightening. "You mean—" "She was studying people," Brooks nodded. "Every dinner, every gala, every brunch. She'd take mental notes: who owned what, where they kept it when they traveled. She was selling that information to a group of professional thieves." Richard leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Brooks placed a folder on the table. "Emails, bank transfers, and photographs." "Look here, this one's from the night of the Wilmington auction." She sent detailed photos of a client's emerald necklace to a broker in Atlanta. She even included the layout of the woman's house. I stared at the glossy photo of Vanessa smiling beside me at that very event. I remembered her saying, "Let me take one for your scrapbook, Evelyn." Only now did I see the truth. She'd angled the shot to capture the jewels of the guests behind us. Brooks continued, "There's more. The broker she worked with, Mark D., has been under investigation for years. We found messages where Vanessa describes you as the perfect cover, an elderly widow with no idea what she owns." My throat went dry. She said that. Brooks' voice softened. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry." For a long moment, I just stared at the papers. The words blurred, the letters swimming into one another. I wasn't just her victim. I was her disguise. Jason entered the room, quietly looking pale and hollow. He'd been staying in the guest wing since the arrest. He didn't speak until the agents finished their briefing. "So she used my mother's reputation to commit crimes," Brooks nodded. "Exactly. She hosted events under your family's name to gain trust. Every time she smiled for a photo, she was scouting her next target." Jason pressed his hands to his face. "God, I married a stranger." I looked at him, my voice low but steady. "You married someone who thought love was ownership, and she's about to learn what love never was." Brooks stood, closing her folder. "We'll be filing additional federal charges this afternoon: fraud, conspiracy, and elder exploitation. We'll need your testimony, Mrs. Carter. It will carry a lot of weight." "I'll do it," I said, "but I'm not testifying for revenge. I'm doing it for closure." The agents left just as the church bells began to ring in the distance. Charleston always sounded serene, even when its secrets were burning. Jason lingered by the window. "Mom," he said quietly, "what if I'd never found out? What if you hadn't acted?" I turned to him. "Then she'd be running my estate by now. You'd be her silent partner, and I'd be in a nursing home somewhere, too confused to know what happened." He winced. "I don't think I'll ever forgive myself for letting it go that far." "Then don't try to forgive yourself," I said. "Just learn from it. That's harder, but it lasts longer." The rest of the morning passed in silence. Clara brought me lunch, though I barely touched it. The air smelled of rain and garden soil. I found myself wandering into Henry's study where the old ledger still lay open. The page with the ring's entry gleamed faintly under the lamp. For 10 years that ledger had been my proof of existence. Now it had become evidence in a federal case. At 3 in the afternoon, Richard returned with updates. The FBI executed a search warrant at Vanessa's boutique this morning, he said. They found another safe filled with counterfeit appraisals, stolen certificates, and cash. Nearly $40,000. I shook my head slowly. She built a fortune on lies and still wanted more. She's being transferred to federal custody in Atlanta tonight, Richard said. The Bureau thinks she might cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. I looked up sharply. Cooperate how? By naming the others involved. The brokers, the thieves, the middlemen. I folded my hands together. Good. Let her talk. Let her expose every person she worked with. I want the truth to echo louder than her excuses. Richard hesitated. Evelyn, the press will keep circling this story. Your family name will be everywhere for a while. I smiled faintly. For years my name meant nothing. Let them say it now. I've earned the right to be known. That evening, as the sun sank low over the marsh, Jason joined me on the porch. The air was thick with the scent of salt and jasmine. He stared at the horizon for a long while before speaking. Do you think she ever loved me? I didn't answer immediately. She loved what you gave her: status, comfort, a stage. But love that takes instead of gives isn't love. It's hunger. He nodded, eyes glistening. I keep remembering how she used to call you Mom. And I keep remembering how she stopped, I said softly. We sat in silence until the crickets began to sing. For the first time in a long while, I felt the faint stirrings of peace. The air around the house seemed lighter, the walls breathing again. When night finally fell, the phone rang once more. It was Agent Brooks. Mrs. Carter, I thought you should know. We reviewed Vanessa's recorded calls from jail. She mentioned you by name. My heart tightened. What did she say? She said, tell her she's not finished yet. I closed my eyes. She never learns. No, ma'am, Brooks said quietly. But that's why people like her end up where they do. After I hung up, I stepped outside. The moon was rising above the magnolias, pale and perfect. I thought of Henry, of everything he'd protected me from, and everything he hadn't been alive to stop. Then I whispered into the night, it's all right, love. She can threaten all she wants. But I'm not the frightened widow she remembers. The wind picked up through the trees, carrying away the last trace of her perfume that still lingered somewhere in these walls. For the first time in years, Carter House smelled only of me. It was raining again the night Charleston's calm finally cracked open. The drops hit the windows in steady rhythm as if the city itself were holding its breath. I was halfway through folding laundry when Richard called. Evelyn, he said, his tone sharp, the FBI just raided Vanessa's house. I set the folded towel aside. Raided? They found more than stolen jewelry. You'd better sit down, but I didn't. I stood still, staring at the wall clock, listening to the storm outside. After everything I thought I was past being surprised, I was wrong. They found dozens of velvet boxes, cash, and a laptop, Richard said. According to Agent Brooks, it's filled with photos of expensive homes, people you know. Every detail, catalog, names, addresses, estimated values. I felt a chill climb my spine. She kept records like I did, I whispered. Only hers were sins, not memories. That's not all, he continued. There's a document labeled Charleston Targets. She'd listed families she met through your events, people she planned to rob next. I let out a breath that sounded like laughter but wasn't. So the police finally see what I've lived with all these years. Evelyn, Richard said gently, Agent Brooks wants to brief you. She's coming by tonight. I lit a small lamp in the sitting room and waited. The rain softened, turning into a whisper against the roof. When the knock came, I already knew it would be her. Agent Brooks stepped inside her hair, damp, her folder wrapped in a plastic sleeve. Mrs. Carter, she said, we need to talk about what we found in that house. She laid out photographs across my coffee table, boxes of jewelry, stacked in a corner, silverware wrapped in tissue paintings leaning against the wall. We've confirmed 32 high-value items, some belonging to at least 5 other families in Charleston. But the most concerning discovery was the second safe in her office. There was another safe, Brooks nodded, hidden behind a panel. Inside we found documents, floor plans, photos, and appraisals. She even drew your house, Mrs. Carter, every room labeled, including the hidden vault behind your husband's portrait. I sank into the armchair, my breath catching. She knew about the vault. Yes, ma'am. We believe she planned to take the rest of your collection once she secured legal guardianship over you. A silence fell between us, broken only by the hum of thunder. Then Brooks added, "We also found emails to a man named Mark Davenport, an art appraiser in Atlanta. He's under federal watch. She sent him detailed images of your pink diamond and other pieces. In one message she wrote, 'The old woman doesn't even know what she has. When she's gone, I'll handle everything.'" I pressed a hand to my mouth. My voice came out barely a whisper. She was going to steal my life piece by piece. Brooks's tone softened. "That's what greed does, Mrs. Carter. It starts small until it becomes the only language someone speaks." Before she could continue, headlights flashed through the rain-streaked window. A car door slammed. Jason's voice called from outside, strained and panicked. "Mom, are you home?" He burst through the door, soaked and shaking. "They just showed me the footage," he said breathlessly. "The FBI, they let me see it. Vanessa had cameras hidden in our house." "Cameras, Mom?" I stared at him. "What, she was recording everything?" "The agent said she used the footage to prove you were forgetful, videos of you looking for your glasses, misplacing your keys. She was building her case." My knees felt weak. I sat back down, gripping the armrest. "She wanted evidence to declare me unfit. And you believed her." Jason dropped to his knees beside me, his voice breaking. "I didn't know, I swear I didn't. She told me it was for a lifestyle blog, some documentary idea about multi-generational living. God, I'm such an idiot." I touched his shoulder. "You were in love. And she knew exactly how to weaponize that." Agent Brooks cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Carter, we've already filed additional charges for surveillance without consent and exploitation. Your cooperation will help us build the case stronger." Jason nodded numbly. "I'll do whatever it takes." The storm outside swelled again, thunder rolling deep over the harbor. I looked toward the window and thought of Henry. He used to say storms reveal the shape of everything. They strip the city bare so you can see its bones. That night it felt true. Brooks gathered her folders. "One more thing, Mrs. Carter. We found a series of financial transfers, payments to shell accounts in Vanessa's name. The amounts total over $200,000. She was laundering profits from stolen goods." I exhaled slowly. "And she hosted charity events to look generous." Brooks gave a small, tight smile. "That's often how they hide, behind philanthropy." As she left, she shook my hand again. "You're stronger than most people I meet in this job," she said quietly. When the door closed, Jason sat in silence, head bowed. "I should have seen it," he said finally. "All the signs were there. The spending, the lies, the way she treated you. I just didn't want to face it." "People see what love lets them see," I told him. "But now you know. And knowing means you can't go back." He nodded, eyes wet. "What happens to her now?" "She'll face court," I said. "And maybe for once she'll have to live without an audience." We sat together for a while, the storm beginning to drift away. I could hear the cicadas returning, cautious, as if testing the quiet. Then Richard called again. "They've taken her to federal holding," he said. "But there's something else you should be aware of." I braced myself. "What now?" Agent Brooks just sent me the full report from the raid. Vanessa wasn't only stealing. She was trading information, selling details about other families to professional thieves. She even shared their alarm codes. I felt a chill deeper than fear. "So she was running a network." "Yes," Richard said grimly. "And it all started here. From your home." After we hung up, I sat there in the half-dark, the storm clouds peeling back from the moon. Jason sat across from me, his face pale and tired. "She used our house as a command center," I murmured. "The place where Henry and I built our life." He looked at me helplessly. "How do we even recover from that?" "By rebuilding," I said. "One truth at a time." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't believe me yet. But I did. For the first time I could see the path clearly. It wasn't just about punishing Vanessa. It was about reclaiming everything she'd tried to erase: our family's name, our dignity, my peace. When Jason finally went to bed, I stayed by the window watching the moonlight touch the wet leaves of the garden. The magnolias glistened, their white petals gleaming against the dark earth. Somewhere downtown sirens echoed faintly as the last remnants of Vanessa's empire fell apart. And in that quiet hour, I whispered into the empty room, "You were right, Henry. It always takes a storm to make things clean again." Richard's voice on the phone was low, but trembling with urgency. "Evelyn, you need to come to my office right now. There's something in the files the FBI recovered from Vanessa's house. You should see it with your own eyes." I dressed quickly, pulling my navy coat tight against the chill. Charleston was gray and damp that morning, the kind of day where the clouds hung so low, it felt like the city was holding its breath. When I arrived, Richard's assistant led me into the conference room. A single brown envelope sat on the table, sealed with a strip of evidence tape. Richard stood by the window, his expression unreadable. "This was found in Vanessa's second safe," he said. "It's not just about the thefts anymore." He handed me the file. My hands shook slightly as I tore the seal and pulled out a stack of papers. The first page stopped me cold. Across the top, bold black letters read, "Petition for guardianship of Evelyn Carter." I stared at it, unable to breathe. Beneath my name was a paragraph typed neatly in legal language. "Due to cognitive decline and inability to manage personal affairs, petitioner requests legal guardianship to ensure the safety and financial stability of the respondent." And there, signed in cursive ink, was her name, Vanessa Carter. "She wanted to have me declared incompetent," I said finally, my voice quiet, detached. Richard nodded grimly. She had already spoken to a law firm in Atlanta. She was preparing to file the petition within a month. I turned the next page. There was a fabricated medical note, false statements claiming I forgot conversations, left the stove on, repeated questions. It was signed by a doctor I'd never even met. My stomach twisted. "She was building her story," I whispered. "She wanted to make me look senile." "That's not all," Richard said softly. He handed me another document, an email chain between Vanessa and an appraiser. One line was underlined. "Once the transfer is complete, the collection can be liquidated legally." For a moment the room tilted. "Transfer?" I asked. "She wanted full control of your estate, Evelyn. Once the court granted her guardianship, she could have sold everything under the guise of financial management." I closed my eyes. Every moment of humiliation, every cruel joke, every time she told me I was forgetful, it all made sense. She wasn't just mean. She was rehearsing. The door opened quietly and Jason stepped in. His face was pale, drawn. "Richard called me," he said. "He said I needed to see this too." I turned toward him, but the words didn't come easily. Richard slid the folder across the table. Jason picked up the papers, scanning the pages. His lips moved silently as he read. When he reached the signatures, his hand went still. "This can't be real," he whispered. "She wouldn't." "She would." I interrupted. "She already did." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and shame. "She said you were losing things, forgetting appointments. I thought—" He stopped, the words choking him. "I know what you thought," I said quietly. "You thought it was easier to believe her than to confront the truth. You were trying to keep the peace, Jason, but that peace came at my expense." He sank into the chair beside me. "I didn't want to see it. None of us do," I said. "We don't want to believe the people we love are capable of cruelty." Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. Clara stepped in, holding a small USB drive. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I think this belongs to the case. I found it while cleaning the guest room at Carter House. It's from the camera system Mrs. Vanessa installed." Jason frowned. "Another one?" "Yes, sir." It was hidden in the vent above the hallway. Richard connected the drive to his laptop and the screen flickered to life. Grainy footage appeared: Vanessa walking through the living room late at night, opening drawers, taking photos of jewelry with her phone. Then a clearer clip, her standing in the kitchen whispering into her phone. The old lady slipping fast. She forgot she even has this bracelet. "When the time's right, I'll have the papers ready." Jason covered his face with his hands. She was documenting everything. Not for a blog, for evidence. I sat back, my voice low but steady. She wanted the world to see me as frail before she took everything that made me strong. The footage ended, leaving silence in its wake. Richard closed the laptop gently. There's enough here for the Bureau to charge her with multiple counts of fraud and elder exploitation. Jason finally lifted his head. Mom, I can't believe this. I lived beside her for 10 years and I didn't see any of it. Because she made sure you didn't, I said. She fed you half-truths and pity until you couldn't tell the difference between her concern and her control. He looked at me, tears bright in his eyes. I don't know how to make it right. By standing beside the truth now, I said, not hiding from it again. Richard's phone buzzed and he stepped aside to answer. When he returned, his face was pale. That was Agent Brooks. They've confirmed Vanessa was working with an art smuggling ring. Your testimony, Evelyn, will help them connect her to the broader operation. Jason's voice was barely a whisper. What does that mean for her federal prison? Richard replied. For a long time, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not joy, not revenge, just release. Then let justice do what I no longer need to, I said. The office was quiet except for the rain tapping against the window. I thought of Henry again, his calm certainty that truth always finds a way to surface. He would have said, "Don't rush it, Evelyn. Let the facts fight for you." When I finally stood, Jason reached for my hand. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for every time I made you doubt yourself." I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the lost boy who disappointed me. I saw my son, the man Henry would have wanted him to become. Then, stop saying sorry, I told him. Start living differently. As we walked out, the city had begun to clear. The rain was thinning to mist and the air smelled of salt and earth. I paused on the steps outside Richard's office, staring at the low gray sky. She took my peace, I murmured, but she'll never take my dignity. Jason squeezed my hand. What will you do now? Tell the truth, I said. Louder this time. He nodded, and for once I could see belief, not doubt, in his eyes. Back home that evening, I sat at Henry's desk and opened my ledger once more. On the last blank page, I wrote a single line in my neatest handwriting, April 28th, justice set in motion. Then I closed the book, locked it in the safe behind his portrait, and whispered, Your story's safe again, my love. But before I could leave the room, my phone buzzed. It was Richard. His message was short. Evelyn, they found more in Vanessa's files. You need to see this in person. I stood very still, the weight of those words pressing into the quiet. Whatever they discovered next, I knew one thing for certain: the past wasn't done speaking yet. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and rain. Outside, a crowd of reporters pressed against the barricades, umbrellas glinting under the gray Charleston morning. Their cameras flashed when I stepped out of the car. I didn't look at them. For 10 years they hadn't seen me at all. Why start now? Inside, the air was cool and tense. Jason walked beside me, his tie crooked, his hands trembling slightly. You don't have to do this, Mom, he murmured. Yes, I do, I said. I've been silent long enough. When the bailiff opened the courtroom doors, the sound of voices swelled a low murmur that broke into whispers when they saw me. At the front, Vanessa sat at the defendant's table, her wrists free but her pride bound tight. She wore a gray suit, no makeup, her hair pulled back. The bright, camera-ready woman I once knew was gone. In her place sat a hollow version of ambition. Richard stood at the plaintiff's table, his papers neatly stacked. He turned to me and nodded. It's time. The judge entered, an older man with kind but stern eyes. This court will hear the case of the United States versus Vanessa Carter, he announced. Charges include grand larceny, fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Vanessa lifted her chin. For a moment, I almost expected her to smile, to perform, but her face remained still, pale as the marble columns behind her. Richard began. Your Honor, this is not a simple case of theft. It is a story of trust betrayed, dignity stripped, and manipulation weaponized against age. Mrs. Evelyn Carter was not just robbed of possessions, she was robbed of her voice. He motioned for me to take the stand. The bailiff held the Bible and I swore the oath. The wood of the witness chair was smooth beneath my hands, grounding me. Mrs. Carter, Richard said gently, could you tell the court what happened the morning you received the text message from the defendant? I took a breath. She said she borrowed my old ring for a party, I replied. But it wasn't an old ring. It was my husband's gift, a pink diamond worth $2.5 million. More than that, it was the symbol of everything we built together. And did you give her permission to take it? No. I didn't even know it was gone until she bragged about it. I glanced at Vanessa. Her eyes darted away. Richard continued, "Can you explain what you discovered afterward?" I told them about the hidden cameras, the forged documents, the guardianship petition. My voice didn't shake. Each word felt like lifting a stone from my chest. She wanted to make me look weak, I said, so she could own what was mine. She called it protection. I call it premeditation. The courtroom was silent, except for the judge's pen-scratching notes. Then Vanessa's attorney stood. "Mrs. Carter," she began smoothly, "at your age, isn't it possible you misremember some details? Perhaps your daughter-in-law was simply caring for you, and you mistook that for manipulation." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I smiled faintly. "I'm 71, counselor, not senile. I've managed a household, an estate, and a lifetime of memories without your client's help. And as for my memory, I pulled out the old leather ledger from my handbag and held it up. I documented every piece, every date, every theft. Because when you're invisible long enough, you learn to keep records of your own existence." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jason lowered his head, wiping a tear. The attorney hesitated, thrown off balance. "But surely, Mrs. Carter, you never imagined your daughter-in-law capable of such a thing." I met her eyes. "Oh, I imagined it. I just hoped I was wrong." Richard stepped forward again. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to introduce Exhibit A, the Carter Inventory Ledger, cross-referenced with police and insurance documentation. Each entry matches a corresponding sale made by the defendant at pawn shops and antique brokers." The clerk took the book and placed it before the judge. As he flipped through the pages, Vanessa's composure began to crack. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes flicking toward Jason as if for rescue, but Jason didn't move. Next, Agent Brooks from the FBI took the stand. She presented the emails, the surveillance footage, the bank transfers. Her voice was clear, methodical. "We confirmed that Vanessa Carter sent images and item lists to multiple art dealers." She referred to the assets as her own inheritance. The defense lawyer tried to argue. "These could have been misunderstandings. Miscommunication," Brooks interrupted firmly. "The defendant also possessed forged medical notes describing Mrs. Carter as mentally unfit. That's not miscommunication. That's fraud." The judge's gaze hardened. "Proceed." When it was Vanessa's turn to speak, she stood shakily clutching the table. "Your Honor, I made mistakes, but I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to make our lives better." Richard crossed his arms. "By stealing from your husband's mother?" Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice rose sharply. "She treated me like a servant, like I didn't belong. I built that house's reputation. I gave her son a life she couldn't give him." The room stirred, whispers swelling. I sat still, watching her unravel. The judge banged the gavel. "Quiet." Vanessa turned toward me, her face contorted. "You never wanted me in that family. You thought I wasn't good enough." I stood slowly, meeting her fury with calm. "No, Vanessa. I thought you were lost. I was wrong, you were dangerous." She flinched as if I'd struck her. The judge cleared his throat. "That will be enough. Mrs. Carter, please sit." Richard approached the bench for closing arguments. "Your Honor, this is a case about power, how easily it shifts when respect dies. Mrs. Carter lost her husband, her peace, and nearly her sanity because she trusted the wrong person. It's time the law restores what was taken." The judge nodded and turned to Vanessa. "Mrs. Carter, do you have anything to add before sentencing?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I never thought she'd fight back. The judge's verdict was swift. For grand larceny, fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy across state lines, this court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison and full restitution of stolen property. The gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. Vanessa gasped, her hands clutching the table. The bailiff stepped forward, guiding her away. Cameras clicked, capturing the moment she finally understood what justice looked like. As she passed me, she whispered through clenched teeth, "You've destroyed your family." I leaned closer. "No, I've rebuilt it." Jason stood behind me, silent tears streaming down his face. When the doors closed behind her, the room exhaled. Outside the courthouse, the storm had broken, leaving the air clear and bright. Reporters shouted questions, but I walked past them, holding my head high. Richard caught up to me on the steps. "You did it," he said quietly. "No," I said. "The truth did." Jason placed a hand on my shoulder. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm so sorry for all the years I didn't defend you." I turned to him, smiling through the exhaustion. "Then defend me now by living differently." He nodded, his voice breaking. "I will." We stood there for a long moment, the city buzzing below us, the courthouse gleaming in the sunlight. For the first time in years, the air around me felt light like freedom. When I finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. The ring was never about money. It was about memory. And today we got both back. Then I walked down those marble steps, each one carrying me further from the years of silence and closer to the woman I used to be. The morning after the verdict, I woke to a strange quiet. No footsteps echoing through the hallway, no voices from the kitchen, no scent of Vanessa's designer perfume clinging to the walls. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if it could finally exhale. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to walk into my own living room. Jason was already there, sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept. When he saw me, he stood quickly. "Mom," he said, voice hoarse. "I didn't know you were up. I've been up since dawn," I replied, taking a seat across from him. "Old habits. I used to wake before your father just to watch the light hit the garden." I'd forgotten how quiet mornings could be. He nodded, staring into his mug. "I can't stop thinking about yesterday. The cameras, the reporters, Vanessa crying in court. It's all replaying in my head." "She chose her path," I said gently. "And now we have to choose ours." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Do you think she'll ever change?" I considered it for a long moment. Change comes from remorse, and remorse comes from truth. I'm not sure she's met either yet. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not hostile. Then Jason said, "I filed the divorce papers this morning. Richard helped me finalize everything. I needed to do it before I lost my nerve." I reached across the table and took his hand. "You didn't lose anything, Jason. You reclaimed yourself." He looked at me, eyes glassy with relief and regret. "I should have done it years ago." I kept convincing myself that love meant forgiveness even when she was destroying everything around her. "Forgiveness without accountability isn't love," I said. "It's surrender." He exhaled a long, shuddering breath. "I don't know what to do next. My life was so wrapped up in hers, I don't even know who I am anymore." "You start small," I said. "You start by making amends to the people you hurt. And you rebuild from there." Outside, the morning light spilled through the magnolia trees. The petals were still damp from last night's rain, their scent filling the air. I thought of Henry again, of how proud he would have been to see his son finally standing tall. Later that afternoon, Richard stopped by with a folder in his hand and a rare smile on his face. "Good news for once," he said. "The FBI confirmed that most of your stolen items will be returned. They've already recovered the pink diamond ring." My breath caught. "You mean it's really back?" He nodded, untouched. "It was found in a secure box at one of the dealer's warehouses. You should have it by the end of the week." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My eyes filled with tears I hadn't realized I was holding back. Henry used to say that ring had a soul. Maybe he was right. Jason smiled faintly. "You'll have to lock it away again, won't you?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "This time I'll wear it. Not because it's valuable, but because it survived just like I did." Richard placed the folder on the table. "There's one more thing. The district attorney's office wants to feature your story in their senior protection campaign. You'd be helping others recognize signs of financial abuse." I laughed softly. Imagine that. Me, the face of a public campaign. "Not the face," he said. "The voice. They want you to speak. Tell your story in your own words." Jason looked at me proudly. "You should do it, Mom. You've been silent too long." I hesitated, my heart fluttering with something between fear and excitement. Maybe it's time. That evening, as the sun sank behind the garden, I sat at Henry's old desk and wrote the opening lines of my speech. The same desk where he'd once planned his exhibitions, where Vanessa had later stood pretending to admire his legacy. I used to think growing old meant fading away, I wrote. Now I know it means becoming clear enough to see who truly stands beside you. The next day, I met with the DA's communications team. They asked to record a short interview at Carter House, capturing what they called the atmosphere of resilience. I almost laughed at that word. For years, these walls had absorbed my silence, my humiliation. Now they'd become proof that endurance could bloom into strength. During the filming, I stood in front of the portrait of Henry, the one hiding the vault, and spoke into the camera. My daughter-in-law thought age made me weak. I said, my voice steady. But age taught me patience. And patience taught me how to fight back without losing myself. When it was over, one of the young producers wiped her eyes. Mrs. Carter, she said softly, you're going to help a lot of people. After they left, the house felt calm again, but not empty. The kind of calm that comes after a storm, when the air smells like new beginnings. I walked to the garden, the grass still damp beneath my shoes, and ran my fingers along the petals of the camellias. Jason joined me with 2 cups of coffee. You sounded incredible, he said. They're already talking about broadcasting your story nationwide. I smiled at him. Maybe this is what Henry meant when he said every wound becomes a window if you let the light through. He looked down, his voice soft. Mom, I don't know how to thank you for forgiving me, for fighting for us. Don't thank me, I said. Just make sure you never let anyone silence me again. He laughed quietly. I think the whole city knows better than to try. For a moment, we just stood there, mother and son, watching the sky turn gold. It struck me how fragile peace could be, yet how strong it felt once earned. Later that night, I sat by the window with the lamp on low, reading through letters that had started arriving after the trial. Some from strangers, some from other elderly women who had faced similar betrayal. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, read, You gave me courage to confront my own daughter-in-law. Thank you for reminding me that age isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I pressed the paper to my chest. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just my story anymore. It belonged to every person who'd ever been dismissed, silenced, or stolen from, because of who they were or what others assumed they couldn't fight for. At midnight, I walked through the quiet house, past the photographs of Henry, past the chair where Vanessa once demanded I fetch her wine. Each object, each memory felt lighter now, as if I had reclaimed their meaning. In the study, I found the empty spot on the velvet display stand where the pink diamond once Saturday. Soon it would rest there again, but this time not as a symbol of fear or loss. It would remind me of endurance, of justice served, of the invisible woman who finally became visible again. As I turned off the light, I whispered to the empty room, You were right, Henry. It wasn't about revenge. It was about remembering who I was before I let anyone tell me otherwise. The clock chimed once in the hallway, steady and sure. Outside, the magnolias swayed gently in the moonlight. For the first time in 10 years, Carter House didn't just feel like a home. It felt like mine again. The package arrived 2 days later, delivered by a discreet courier in a dark suit. He handed me a small sealed box wrapped in brown paper and said only signature required, Mrs. Carter. I signed, thanked him, and carried it to the kitchen table. My hands were steady as I unwrapped it, but my heart was not. Inside lay the pink diamond ring, softly glowing under the morning light, as if the years of deceit hadn't dulled its fire. Jason stood behind me, watching quietly. It's even more beautiful than I remember, he said. I smiled faintly. It hasn't changed. We have. When I slipped the ring onto my finger, it felt cold at first, then warm like recognition. For 10 years it had been a ghost, whispered about, hidden away, then stolen. Now it was back where it belonged, and with it came something deeper than relief. It was dignity restored. Later that afternoon, I placed the ring back in its velvet box and set it on Henry's desk. You're home, I whispered. Then I sat down to write him a letter, as I often did when words felt too heavy to say aloud. Henry, I wrote, she's gone. The house is quiet again. Jason's finding his way, and I'm learning to breathe without bitterness. I think you'd be proud of how it ended. Justice wasn't loud, it was patient. I paused, looking at the empty chair across the desk. You once told me revenge is a sharp tool that dulls the hand that holds it. But justice, Henry, justice repairs what revenge can't. That evening the phone rang. It was Agent Brooks, Mrs. Carter, we thought you should know the rest of the stolen items from the other families have been recovered. And because of your testimony, the Bureau's closing this case successfully. You've helped more people than you realize." I exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Agent. I didn't plan to become an example." She chuckled softly. "The best ones never do." After the call, I stepped outside to the garden. The air smelled of rain and wisteria. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. I could walk from one room to another without feeling watched or belittled. I could exist again in my own home without apology. Jason joined me on the porch carrying 2 cups of tea. He looked lighter, younger, even as if a weight had lifted from his shoulders. "Mom," he said, sitting beside me, "I wanted to tell you something before I lose my nerve." I arched an eyebrow. "That sounds serious," he smiled nervously. "There's someone I've been seeing. Her name's Emily. She's kind, thoughtful, nothing like—" He trailed off, unable to say the name. "I understand," I said gently. "And does she make you happy?" He nodded. "She does. But I was scared to tell you. After everything that happened, I didn't want you to think I was repeating the same mistake." I reached over and touched his hand. "You're not Jason. The mistake wasn't loving the wrong person. It was not seeing yourself when love blinded you. If Emily helps you see who you are again, then she's already a better choice." He smiled, relief washing over his face. "I'd like you to meet her sometime." "I'd like that very much," I said. We sat there as the sun dipped below the magnolia trees, the air glowing gold. I thought about how life always finds a way to begin again, even after betrayal, even after the kind of silence that rots the soul. Later that night, while Jason was asleep, I found myself drawn to the living room. I turned on the lamp and opened one of Henry's old record sleeves, his favorite jazz album. As the needle touched the vinyl, the room filled with that warm, crackling sound, and for a moment I felt him there beside me. The memories came easily now, not as wounds but as reminders. The garden parties we used to host, the laughter echoing down the halls, the way he'd tuck my hand into his arm as we walked by the harbor on summer nights. That was the life Vanessa could never steal, because it wasn't built on things, it was built on love and resilience. I stood in front of the mirror above the fireplace, studying my reflection. The years had lined my face, softened my features, but in my eyes I saw something new: certainty. The kind that comes only after you've been broken and rebuilt yourself piece by piece. The next morning, a reporter from a national paper called. She wanted to feature my story as part of a series on elder justice. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "your case has inspired legislation talks in several states. You've become something of a symbol." I laughed quietly. At 71, I was hoping to become a gardener, not a symbol. She smiled through the phone. "Sometimes life plants different seeds." After the interview, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. People waved as I passed, neighbors who used to look away now stopping to say hello. One woman, Mrs. Lang, from 2 houses down, clasped my hand. "I watched your story on the news," she said. "My daughter's been taking my checks without asking. I thought I couldn't do anything about it, but you gave me courage." Her words stayed with me all day. Courage. Such a simple word for something so rare. When I returned home, I found a letter waiting on the doorstep. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. It was from Vanessa. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. "Evelyn," it began, "I know you have no reason to read this, but I need you to know that I've been thinking about everything. About you. About what I did. Prison strips you down until there's nothing left but truth, and I'm finally seeing mine. I was jealous of your grace, your strength, the love your son had for you. I wanted to possess what I couldn't become. I destroyed myself trying to outshine someone who never needed a spotlight. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to hear me say I'm sorry." The words blurred for a moment before I folded the letter carefully. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't even feel anger anymore. Just a quiet, settled sadness for what she could have been if she hadn't chosen deceit over love. That night, I placed her letter in the same box as Henry's. Not beside the ring, but near it, close enough to remind me that even broken things have lessons to give. As I turned off the light, I whispered into the stillness, "You were right again, Henry. The sweetest revenge isn't punishment. It's peace." The next morning, when I stepped into the garden, the first camellia of the season had bloomed, a single white flower glistening with dew. I smiled and whispered, I know love. I see it too. And for the first time in decades, I felt the quiet joy of a woman who had finally completely come home to herself. A year later, I stood in front of a mirror in a television studio in downtown Charleston, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. The lights were warm, the air buzzing with quiet energy as the crew prepared for another live recording of Evelyn's Truth. What started as a single interview had become a weekly show broadcast nationwide. Every week, people called to share their stories of silence, betrayal, resilience. The kind I once thought no one would ever listen to. A young producer peeked into the dressing room. "Mrs. Carter, 5 minutes till we're live." I smiled. "Thank you, dear." She hesitated before adding, "My grandmother watches you every Sunday. She says you remind her to stand up for herself." Those words still stunned me, no matter how many times I heard them. I wasn't just Evelyn Carter, the quiet widow who'd once been invisible in her own home. I'd become a voice for women like her, like me. When the red light above the camera blinked on, I took a steady breath and began. "Good evening, I'm Evelyn Carter. Tonight we're talking about dignity, what it means to lose it, and what it takes to get it back." As I spoke, the images on the monitor behind me changed faces of elderly women who'd written in couples who'd rebuilt their trust after betrayal, families who had faced down manipulation and greed. Each story in some way echoed mine. After the recording, I stepped outside. Charleston's twilight wrapped around the city in soft pink and gold. Jason was waiting by the car. He waved as I approached, that easy smile back on his face, the one I hadn't seen since he was a boy. "You were incredible tonight," he said, holding the car door open. I laughed softly. "You always say that." "Because it's true," he replied. "You've built something, Mom. You turned all that pain into power." We drove in comfortable silence, the radio playing quietly in the background. When we reached Carter House, the porch lights glowed like beacons. The garden Henry and I planted decades ago was blooming again, full of color and life. Inside the house felt different now, not haunted, not hollow. There were fresh flowers on the table, laughter in the kitchen when Jason visited with Emily, and sunlight streaming through rooms that had once been dark. As I hung up my coat, I noticed the framed newspaper on the wall, From Victim to Advocate, the woman who brought Charleston's scandal to justice. Beneath the headline was a photo of me holding the pink diamond ring. It still made me smile. That ring, now resting in a glass case in the City Museum, had become a symbol of justice, proof that even the smallest act of courage can unravel years of silence. Later that evening, we had dinner together, Jason, Emily, and me. Emily had a gentle laugh that filled the room, and she treated me with the kind of respect that didn't need to be performed. She reached across the table, smiling. "Evelyn, I saw the show tonight. That woman who called in, the one whose son was stealing her pension, you gave her hope. She said she's going to hire a lawyer tomorrow." I nodded, stirring my tea. Sometimes all people need is permission to believe they deserve better. Jason looked at me with quiet pride. "Dad would have been proud of you, Mom." "I hope so," I said softly. "I think about him every time I walk through that garden. It's strange, he's been gone over a decade, but lately I feel closer to him than ever." After dinner, they said goodnight and left for their home a few streets away. I stayed behind the house, wrapped again in its calm. I walked to the study, lit only by the faint glow of the desk lamp. The familiar scent of old paper and lavender oil filled the air. On the wall hung Henry's portrait, and beside it a framed letter, the one I'd written to him after Vanessa's sentencing. The letter had become my quiet reminder that peace was something you built, not something you waited for. I sat at the desk, opened my journal, and began to write. June 7th, 1 year since the trial. Vanessa's appeal was denied. She'll serve her full sentence. Jason is rebuilding. The foundation has helped over 500 families prevent exploitation. The house is alive again. I paused, the pen hovering above the page. And me, I'm no longer invisible. I closed the journal and leaned back in the chair, listening to the crickets outside. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang steady and low. The next morning, I hosted the first charity gala for the Evelyn Carter Foundation for Elder Justice. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight, and the guests, lawyers, advocates, social workers, and survivors, filled the air with laughter and conversation. As I looked around the room, I saw faces that had once looked beaten, now glowing with pride. Richard stood beside me, raising a glass. "You've done it, Evelyn. You've turned tragedy into legacy." I smiled. "We did it. You never let me give up," he chuckled. "You wouldn't have let me even if I tried." When it was my turn to speak, the crowd quieted. I stepped onto the small stage, the pink diamond displayed behind me in its glass case loaned for the evening by the museum. Its soft light glimmered across the room. Exactly 1 year ago I sat alone in a courtroom while the woman who betrayed me was sentenced. I thought that would be the end of my story. But I've learned something since then. It wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. I looked out at the faces before me, some tearful, some smiling. For a long time I believed silence was the price of survival. I thought dignity meant enduring without complaint. But silence protects no one. Dignity is not endurance, it's truth. And truth once spoken cannot be silenced again. The applause rose like a wave. I glanced toward the glass case, the diamond catching the light, and for a fleeting moment I could almost see Henry's reflection beside it, smiling. Later that night, after the last guest had gone, I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the city. The air was cool, the harbor lights twinkling in the distance. Jason joined me, slipping his arm around my shoulders. "Mom," he said, "you've changed so many lives, including mine." I turned to him and smiled. Then everything was worth it. We stood there in silence for a while, watching the water shimmer under the moonlight. It was the same harbor Henry and I used to walk along, the same city that had once looked down on an old widow and now listened when she spoke. When Jason finally left, I stayed out there alone, letting the breeze move through the magnolia trees. I closed my eyes and whispered, "We did it, Henry. We really did." The next morning I woke early and went to the garden. The first rays of sunlight were cutting through the mist, turning the petals of the camellias into soft blush gold. I knelt, touched the soil, and felt a pulse of life beneath my fingertips. Everything I had lost, everything I had fought for, was right there in that stillness. My house, my peace, my family, my voice. And as the birds began to sing, I smiled and whispered the words that had carried me through every storm. "The sweetest revenge," I said, "is rebuilding your life so beautifully that the pain has nowhere left to live." If you've listened to my story, thank you. Tell me where you're from in the comments below. I always love knowing how far a story can travel. And if you've ever been silenced, remember, this truth is patient, and justice always finds its way home. So stay strong, stay kind, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories where silence ends and the light finally begins.